One thing we can do, let's be honest, the biggest problem with clemency isn't that it's an inefficient system, because it's been an inefficient system regardless of who the government is. The biggest problem with clemency is that we have too many people that need it. And this started a long time ago, and you can go to Richard Nixon and the war on drugs, you can go to the sentencing guidelines and the enhancements for crack cocaine, which absolutely disproportionately affected African Americans in cities. You can go to states like mine who end up in federal court off of Native American reservations in an incredibly period of time. So what do? We try to retroactively apply sentencing guideline reform again. Yes. That's how you do it, because you diffuse it between 535 members of Congress instead of one person sitting in the executive branch, because nobody's ever lost an election being tough on crime. And instead of having hearings where we're taking pot shots at the ranking member of the committee and taking pot shots at the ranking member of the full committee, we should have hearings like this every single day of the week. And we should be talking about it. And the reason I know this is because I've done it. You didn't have to worry about minimum mandatory sentences. You blew so far past the minimum mandatory sentence because you had a boyfriend who was dealing drugs, and I'm assuming somewhere along the line in that conspiracy, somebody had a gun, so they made it violent. Which comes back when you look at this. One of the first things we can do, and I know U.S. attorneys are great people. I supported the last Democratic U.S. appointee in North Dakota, and I supported the last 2 Republican ones. But I don't think anybody ever intended prosecutors to be able to determine sentences, and that's what happened. Because how they charge something, how we draconianly enhance drug weights in historical methamphetamine or drug conspiracies without ever having a drug in the courtroom. How we put those drugs on a low-level member of that conspiracy because they are using minor amounts of drugs to feed their addiction, and we treat them just like the leader of a drug cartel. That's how we end up in this situation. We did federal sentencing guideline reform. Have we checked to see what states that have mirrored their sentencing guidelines are starting to reform theirs as well? Minnesota's a neighboring state. I used to practice law in Minnesota. Anybody thinks Minnesota's a liberal state should get convicted of a crime there. After the First Step Act, their state sentencing guidelines are worse than the federal ones. Do they know if they're taking it forward? And there are states that are doing this. Texas has done criminal justice reform. North Dakota has done criminal justice reform. How are we providing services? Why aren't we not utilizing, the one thing the federal government does really, really well is a pretrial release program. It's actually one of the greatest ironies in anything. It's non-confrontational. They get you into life choices. They get you into addiction treatment. They do all of those things. Then you show up at court and you get a 10-year minimum mandatory sentence. I don't care how good your pretrial release program is. If you're going to prison for 8.5 years, you're not really going to remember anything about it. So instead of pointing fingers at the executive branch when we're doing this, how do we solve it? This is hard work. And the reason it's hard work is if you make 1,000 right decisions and 1 wrong decision, and that happens to be in your district, you are going to get penalized politically for it. Every one of us. We run every 2 years. So you have to stand up and be counted, and you have to do it. And you have to do it in a way that actually effectuates change. And there are ways to do it. One, you go back and you concentrate on nonviolent crimes. But you define nonviolent crimes not in how they were prosecuted in 1998. You look at them. And if there was a gun associated in a drug conspiracy, but it was associated 17 levels removed from that particular sentence, that's not a violent crime. It's simply not. And so instead of sitting here and blaming people and doing those, and I'm supporting clemency, I'm on a letters of clemency, I will advocate for people all the time, but let's recognize the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is we started down this path 40 to 50 years ago and have allowed it to snowball ever since. And let's also recognize that regardless of how anybody feels about anybody, the single biggest piece of criminal justice reform that has ever come out of Washington, D.C. was the First Step Act. But that is only the first step. And then we should also recognize the fact that the vast 95% of this happens at the local and state level. County jails are full of people who are serving pre-trial. So let's utilize technology. Let's invest in those things. Let's do GPS tracking. Let's do scram bracelets. Let's work at those things. Because the vast majority of people who ever get sentenced in the federal court system, it ain't their first trip to the rodeo. They've been in misdemeanor cases. They've been in county jail. They've been in state jail. They've been through all of these things. So let's utilize the resources to attack this before they get it. And then finally, we need to start addressing the fact that we're felonizing nonviolent drug offenders from the age of 18 to 22. Because you talk about collateral consequences, but here's what I can tell you. You have one felony, the chances of you having another one go up exponentially, because we have created perverse incentives for every government program we have to avoid felons like the plague. So if we want to deal with this, we can deal with it, but I don't think throwing political potshots at each other up here is the right way, and with that, I yield back.